The crystal glasses caught the candlelight like captured stars. It was the 15th of July, 1946. The Georgievsky Hall of the Kremlin blazed with 1,000 fires. Chandeliers the size of carriages hung from gilded ceilings, throwing warm amber across the faces of 300 people who represented, at that precise moment, the absolute summit of Soviet power. Ministers, marshals, academics, artists, the men and women who had survived the war, survived the purges, survived each other, and arrived here tonight in black tie and silk to celebrate the first anniversary of the Potsdam Conference. Outside, Moscow was still rebuilding. Entire neighborhoods remained rubble. Children played in craters. But inside these walls, the chandeliers burned as though nothing had ever been broken. This is where our story begins. Not in a dungeon, not in a courtroom. Here, in the most beautiful room, in the most powerful building in the largest country on earth, with the sound of an orchestra playing a Viennese waltz and the scent of white lilies arranged along tables that groaned under the weight of delicacies most Soviet citizens would never taste in their lifetimes. A woman entered on the arm of her husband. She was 31 years old, dark hair, pale skin, a black evening dress that moved like water when she walked. Her name was Evgenia Gorkusha-Shirshova, and every eye in the room turned toward her, because that was simply what happened when Evgenia Gorkusha entered a room. It had always been that way, from the provincial theaters of Tula to the silver screens of Moscow. There was something about her that the camera understood, even when audiences couldn't quite explain it. A quality the director Isidor Anensky once described in a letter now held in the Russian State Archive as an interior light, the kind that doesn't require a spotlight. Her husband squeezed her arm. Pyotr Petrovich Shirshov, hero of the Soviet Union, Arctic explorer, minister of the naval fleet, a man whose name had once made the entire country press their ears to radio receivers in breathless anticipation. They were, by any measure, the most remarkable couple in that room, and in a room full of people who had outlasted both war and terror. That was saying something extraordinary. For a few hours, it was simply a party. Glasses clinked. Molotov asked to be introduced to the enchanting wife of Comrade Shirshov. Laughter moved through the crowd in waves. The orchestra shifted into a slower rhythm. Evgenia smiled at something her husband whispered, and for one moment, just one, the world appeared to be exactly as it should be. Then Lavrentiy Beria walked over. If you study the photographs of Lavrentiy Beria, and the declassified KGB archives contain dozens of them, what strikes you is how ordinary he looks. Small, slightly built, round spectacles on a round face. A man you might pass in a corridor and forget immediately. There is nothing in those photographs to explain the terror his name produced, the way conversation stopped when he entered a room, the way grown men, decorated war heroes, brilliant scientists, steel-nerved commanders, found reasons to look elsewhere when he approached. But power is rarely visible in a face. It lives in context. And in July of 1946, Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria was the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union, the head of the secret police, the architect of the Gulag system, and a man who had, by that point in his career, sent hundreds of thousands of people to their deaths with the stroke of a pen, or simply the nod of a head. He crossed the Georgievsky Hall in no particular hurry. He kissed Evgenia's hand and held it a moment longer than courtesy required. He complimented her beauty. He asked her to dance, and according to multiple witnesses, their accounts collected in the investigative file that Maria Shirshova, Evgenia's daughter, finally accessed in 2001. What happened next unfolded in less than 4 minutes. The waltz, the floor, his hand pressing against the small of her back with a pressure that announced itself as something other than dancing, a whisper near her ear, an invitation to his dacha at Tsaritsino, the words, "It would benefit you," and their unmistakable implication, benefit you or else. Evgenia asked to return to her husband's table. Beria escorted her there, and then, in front of 300 people, in front of the assembled power of the Soviet state, he leaned down toward her and spoke loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "So, did we come to an agreement, my beauty? I'll send a car tomorrow evening." 300 pairs of eyes turned. Pyotr Shirshov rose from his chair, but Evgenia was faster. The sound of the slap moved through the Georgievsky Hall like a gun shot in a cathedral. Beria's glasses slid down his nose. A fork fell somewhere, and its single metallic note rang in the silence like a bell. An orchestra player lowered his bow. Evgenia's voice, witnesses later recalled, was completely steady. "I'm not a chorus girl from the NKVD ensemble." Dead silence. Then Beria picked up his glasses, settled them back on his face, and looked at her. His expression, according to every account, was perfectly calm. Only his eyes, behind the glass lenses, burned with something that required no translation. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Very interesting, Comrade Shirshova. I will remember this." He turned and walked away. "Now freeze that image, hold it. Because this is the moment that this investigation is about." Not the slap itself, though in the context of 1946 Soviet Russia, a public slap delivered to the second most powerful man in the state was an act so audacious it beggars comprehension. What this investigation is about is the 14 days that followed, the machinery that was set in motion, the files that were opened, and the files that were sealed, the human beings who were moved across the board like chess pieces, and the human beings who were simply removed from the board entirely. 14 days after that evening in the Georgievsky Hall, Evgenia Gorkusha vanished, not metaphorically, not professionally. She physically disappeared, taken from the family dacha on the Rublyovka highway by the Minister of State Security himself, Viktor Abakumov, under the pretext of an urgent summons to the theater. She kissed her 1.5-year-old daughter on the forehead. She sat down in a black ZIS automobile, and she was gone. For 10 years, her name was forbidden. Not simply forgotten, forbidden. As though Evgenia Gorkusha had never drawn breath, never appeared on a screen, never made a generation of Soviet audiences laugh and weep and fall in love with cinema. The woman who had been called the most beautiful actress in the USSR was erased from official history with the thoroughness of a bureaucratic deletion. But here's where history begins to speak in a different register. In 2001, the archives of the Federal Security Service, successor to the KGB, were partially declassified. Among the thousands of files released was a slim cardboard folder marked with a case number, a date, and a name. The documents inside: interrogation transcripts, internal memos, medical examination records, and a handwritten letter in a handwriting that grew progressively unsteady across its pages, constitute one of the most complete and most devastating records of individual destruction to emerge from the Stalin era. Maria Petrovna Shirshova, who by that point had spent 40 years as an oceanographer at the very institute her father once directed, sat down with those files in a reading room in Moscow and did not leave for 3 days. The handwriting, she told the journalist Andrei Kolesnikov in an interview published in Novaya Gazeta in 2003. "My mother's handwriting got worse and worse through the transcripts. By the end, it was barely recognizable as handwriting at all. You could see page by page what they were doing to a person, what it cost to break someone like her." She paused for a long time before continuing. "But here's the thing, they had to break her. She didn't break on her own, and that means something. This is a story about a slap, about what that slap cost, about a woman who understood in the fraction of a second before her hand moved that she was choosing her dignity over her safety, and made the choice anyway. It is also a story about a system, about how totalitarian power processes the unforgivable offense of a human being who refuses to disappear quietly, about the machinery of erasure and the extraordinary effort required to erase one woman who simply said, "No, And it is a story about memory, about a 12-year-old girl sitting in the dark of a revival cinema in the autumn of 1956, watching a figure on the screen laugh and sing and whispering a single word into the dark. Mama. We begin at the beginning, with a woman who was not yet a star, not yet a wife, not yet a symbol, but simply a child on a train, holding a doll while her world disappeared behind her, asking whether they would ever go home. The answer, as it turned out, would take a lifetime. There is a particular kind of poverty that carries itself with perfect posture. Petrograd, March of 1915. The maternity ward on Vasilyevsky Island smelled of carbolic soap and cold stone. Outside, the second year of the World War ground on in the mud of distant trenches, and the city that had once called itself the glittering capital of an empire was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to tremble at its foundations. But inside the ward, a 43-year-old woman with aristocratic cheekbones and exhausted eyes looked at her newborn daughter and smiled. Late child, possibly the last, a final gift from a life that had already taken so much. Her name was Elena Vladimirovna Avramova, and she came from a line of Polish nobility that had lost its fortune in the final decade of the previous century, but retained, with a ferocity that money cannot buy, its manners, its bearing, and its absolute conviction that certain things were non-negotiable. Her father, Stanislav Yanovsky, had said it plainly. You can lose everything except your dignity. We may eat black bread, but the spine must be straight. It was a sentence his daughter had carried into adulthood. It was a sentence she would pass without ceremony to her own child. Her husband, Alexander Evmenovich Gorkusha, was everything Elena was not, in the best possible sense, a Ukrainian farmer's son who had made himself an agronomist through sheer will and a refusal to accept that birth-determined destination, practical where she was dreamy, grounded where she was ethereal. He looked at his wife, according to their neighbors' later recollections, the way a man looks at a rare bird that has landed unexpectedly on his windowsill, with wonder and with the slight anxiety that it might fly away at any moment. "What shall we name her?" he asked, holding the tiny bundle. Elena did not hesitate. "Evgenia. After Evgeny on again. Let there be more poetry in her life than in ours. There would be poetry, but first there would be revolution." The world that greeted Evgenia Gorkusha as she learned to walk and speak and recognize her own reflection was a world in the process of catastrophic reinvention. By the time she was 6 years old, the empire was gone, the Tsar was dead, and the new Soviet state was sorting its citizens into categories with the cold efficiency of a filing system. And the category that the Gorkusha family occupied, Polish nobility, however impoverished, however long stripped of its estates, was not a safe category to occupy in the autumn of 1921. "Pack, Lena. We are leaving for Kiev." Alexander arrived home one October evening with the expression of a man who has already made a decision and is simply informing the relevant parties. The poet Gumilev had been shot the previous month. Aristocratic origin had become a brand, and brands in Soviet Russia burned. Little Evgenia was playing with the one doll that had not yet been traded for bread. The other toys were gone, exchanged one by one for food as the family's savings dissolved in the revolutionary inflation that turned fortunes into paper and paper into nothing. "But our things, the furniture," Elena began. "Forget the furniture." In a freight car packed with other refugees, 6-year-old Evgenia pressed against her mother's side and asked the question that children have asked in every displacement since the beginning of human migration. "Mama, will we come back home?" "Of course, my darling, of course we will." Elena stroked her daughter's hair and thought, "I do not know if our home will still exist. I do not know if our Russia will still exist." She was right on both counts, but the child fell asleep against her shoulder, and for now that was enough. Kiev received the refugees with autumn mud and the particular indifference of a city accustomed to receiving the desperate. But it was in Kyiv, in a drafty rehearsal room attached to the Kyiv Russian Drama Theater, that something ignited. Evgenia was 14 when she first walked onto a stage. She had not planned it. She had not trained for it. She wandered into the theatrical studio the way certain people wander toward exactly the thing they were made for, without understanding yet what the pull means. And the old teacher, a former actor of the Imperial Theaters, who had survived the revolution by making himself useful to the new regime, watched her for 20 minutes and then called Elena Vladimirovna aside. "Your daughter has a gift," he said. And then, after a pause, with the involuntary honesty of a man who has spent a lifetime in the theater, "In our time, a gift is often a curse. The talented burn too bright and extinguish too fast." He did not know, and could not have known, how precisely prophetic those words would turn out to be. The years that followed were the years of becoming. Tula. A drafty dressing room, a space heater that never quite reached operating temperature, an audience of 30 people watching the 100th performance of Lyubov Yarovaya. And every time Evgenia Gorkusha walked onto that stage, those 30 people applauded, as though she had given them something they had not known they were missing. The director noticed. Letters arrived from Baku. Warm climate, double the salary. Another case, another train, another city that smelled of something new. Baku smelled of oil and the Caspian wind, and here the local paper Bakinsky Rabachi wrote about Comrade Gorkusha as a discovery for our theater. She was 22. She had already lived in 4 cities, survived a revolution, and learned that home was a portable concept, something you carried in your spine, as her grandfather had insisted, not in your address. Then Sverdlovsk. Then the knock at the dressing room door that changed everything. "Evgenia, urgent, the director wants you. Wants." The man waiting in the director's office was unremarkable at first glance. Glasses, intelligent eyes, the slightly distracted manner of someone whose mind is always half occupied with something invisible to everyone else. He introduced himself simply. "Isidor Anensky, film director. I'm looking for an actress for the lead role in a new picture about aviators. I saw you in the storm scene last night. You are exactly what I need." The film was called The Fifth Ocean. The screen tests were, by every account that survives, remarkable. Anensky wrote in his production diary, held now at the Russian State Film Archive, that Evgenia Gorkusha possessed something that no amount of technical training could manufacture and no amount of technical absence could entirely destroy. She was completely, unnervingly honest on camera. At a time when Soviet cinema demanded heroic types, broad shoulders, confident smiles, eyes fixed on the radiant future, Evgenia brought something warmer and stranger: doubt, tenderness, the specific vulnerability of a person who's trying very hard and knows they might fail. "The camera sees an interior light," Anensky wrote. "I cannot explain it technically. I can only say that when she's on screen, you cannot look anywhere else." On the Moscow set, a second encounter occurred, the kind that, in retrospect, feels inevitable, though at the time it felt simply like luck. A tall, handsome man with a poet's restless eyes appeared one afternoon to discuss the film's songs. "This is Yaroslav Rodionov," Anensky said. "He wrote the music." Yaroslav took Evgenia's hand and kissed it. "I think now I know for whom I wrote those lines," he said. "It was," everyone agreed later, "terribly romantic. The kind of meeting you put in films." The premiere of The Fifth Ocean in 1940 opened to lines that stretched around city blocks. Letters poured into the studio from workers, students, factory managers, collective farm administrators, all saying variations of the same thing. "We saw something on that screen that we did not expect to feel." The newspaper Pravda called Evgenia Gorkusha a new star of Soviet cinema, the kind of coverage that meant, in that particular universe, that you had arrived at the absolute peak of what was possible. She was 25 years old. She was famous across the largest country on earth. She was engaged to a man who wrote poems about her eyes. And outside the cinema on the night of the premiere, with the Moscow crowd still buzzing on the pavement, Yaroslav pressed his lips to her ear and asked her to marry him. She said yes without a second's hesitation. "I feel," she told him, watching her own image on the screen, "that I have been walking toward this my whole life, this role. This moment, you." She could not have known, no one ever can, that the happiness would last exactly 3 years, that the man beside her would go to a war he did not have to go to because he believed it would be shameful not to, that the telegram bearing the word "killed" would arrive on a morning in March of 1943, and she would stand at her window holding the paper and watching the snow melt in the street below, unable to process the fact that the world was continuing when it had absolutely no right to. At 28, Evgenia Gorkusha was a widow. She went back to the theater the next morning. Yaroslav would have wanted this, she told the director, who had offered her as much time as she needed. It was the most honest thing she said that year, and it told you everything about who she was. The war was not finished with her. It had, in fact, barely begun. On the 16th of October, 1941, 6 months before the telegram that ended her first life, Moscow experienced what historians would later call Black Tuesday. The Germans had broken through the Mozhaisk defensive line. The capital was 100 kilometers from the front. Rumors tore through the city like fever. Stalin has fled. The government is gone. The Germans arrive tomorrow. On the Great Stone Bridge, amid the chaos of a city losing its nerve, a young actress with a small suitcase walked through the empty October wind, and a government automobile came too fast around a corner on the icy pavement, and she slipped, and a man in naval uniform jumped out of the back seat before the car had fully stopped. "My God, are you hurt? Are you all right?" His name was Pyotr Shirshov. The country knew his face from every newspaper, and this accident on a bridge on the worst day Moscow had lived through in living memory was the beginning of the second chapter. The one that would end in a hall of crystal chandeliers, with a sound like a gunshot and a silence that lasted 10 years. There is a particular kind of love that only war produces, not the love of peacetime, the comfortable, unhurried love of Sunday mornings and shared routines and the quiet accumulation of ordinary days. War produces something different, sharper, more desperate. The love of people who understand, at some cellular level, that tomorrow is not guaranteed, and that warmth, human warmth, is the only reliable argument against the darkness pressing in from every direction. Moscow, winter of 1942. The city was frozen in every sense of the word. In a small apartment on the Arbat, Evgenia Gorkusha sat wrapped in her winter coat because the electricity had been cut for the 3rd consecutive day, and the temperature inside was 5 degrees below zero. She'd not been to the theater in a week. She had not heard from Yaroslav in 3 weeks, and the silence from the front had a quality that she refused to name. On the wall, a small photograph. Her wedding day. Yaroslav in his military uniform already. They had married quickly, as people did in that summer of 41, understanding instinctively that time was a luxury. The knock at the door came in the early evening. Pyotr Shirshov stood in the doorway, holding a sack of firewood in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other, looking slightly embarrassed by both. He had stopped by, he explained, because he had heard from the theater director that she was staying in the city alone, and this was simply, he paused, searching for the right word, unacceptable. "Move to the Hotel Moskva," he said. "At least there is heating. I have arranged it." "What will people say, Pyotr Petrovitch? You are a married man. You are a minister." "To hell with what people say. The Germans are 80 kilometers away, and you are worrying about propriety?" He was right, of course, and this is the detail that every honest account of their story must acknowledge. What began between them in those winter months was not a calculated seduction, not an opportunistic arrangement, but something that the circumstances of total war made almost inevitable. Two profoundly lonely people, one waiting for letters that came less and less frequently, the other working 20-hour days to keep a shattered fleet operational while his family sat in evacuation thousands of kilometers away, finding in each other, against all logic and all caution, the specific human warmth that keeps a person from becoming merely a function. The archives of the Naval Commissariat contain Shirshov's operational logs from that winter, 12-hour meetings, emergency telegrams about the northern convoys, the transport of 600 tanks from Iran across the Caspian under German aerial bombardment. These are the dry facts of a man who was, by any objective measure, doing something genuinely heroic with his waking hours. But the personal diary, the one his daughter Maria found in a cardboard box under her father's desk after his death, tells a parallel story. Brief entries, often just a sentence or two written in the margins of official documents because there was no other time. Saw Evgenia at the Mossovet Theater tonight. She played the scene in Act 2 as though she were explaining something to me personally. How does she do that? Evgenia said I was a real hero. I told her the real heroes are in the trenches. She said, Pyotr, the man who keeps the supply lines open in a storm, is the reason the men in the trenches eat tomorrow. I have thought about this all day. She laughs, and the room changes. You need to understand who Pyotr Shirshov was to understand what his love for Evgenia meant, and what it ultimately cost. In May of 1937, the entire Soviet Union had pressed its ear to the radio to hear a single announcement. 4 men had landed on the North Pole. For the first time in human history, a team of scientists would live and work on a drifting ice floe in the Arctic Ocean, conducting research at the literal top of the world. The mission was called North Pole 1. The team leader was Ivan Papanin. The biologist and hydrologist was Pyotr Shirshov. They drifted for 274 days. The ice floe, initially 4 kilometers square, shrank as it moved south into warmer waters. By the end, their entire world measured 50 meters across. They slept in their clothes, fully dressed, ready at any moment to jump into water that would kill a man in 4 minutes. Shirshov once broke through thin ice and was pulled out by Papanin with his bare hands, half drowned and nearly frozen. Papanin wrote in his diary, Petka Shirshov is the soul of our team. When things were at their worst, he would sing Ukrainian songs and make jokes that had no right to be funny and somehow were. This man is made of something different from ordinary people. When the icebreakers finally reached them in February of 1938, Moscow received them like cosmonauts returning from another planet. Flowers, orchestras, crowds so dense you could not see the pavement. Stalin personally pinned their gold stars and asked each man what he wanted. Science or state service. Wherever you send me, Comrade Stalin, Shirshov said. This was the man who fell in love with an actress on a frozen bridge during an October panic. A man who had survived the Arctic and was discovering that survival and living are not the same thing at all. In the final weeks of 1943, Evgenia understood she was expecting a child. The conversation that followed was brief and without performance. Pyotr did not hesitate for a moment. Have the child. I will divorce. I promise. How do you divorce in the middle of a war, Pyotr? I will find a way. His first wife, Fina Evgenievna, had returned from evacuation with their 2 children. She received the news with a composure that witnesses found more devastating than any scene could have been. She packed nothing that belonged to him. On his last visit to collect his things, she said simply, Take care of her, Petya. She's not as strong as she appears. It was an extraordinary thing for a woman in that position to say. It suggests she understood Evgenia better, perhaps, than the people who loved her. On the 16th of December, 1944, in the Grauerman Maternity Hospital, Evgenia gave birth to a daughter. What shall we name her? Pyotr asked, holding the bundle with the careful inexperience of a man who has held ice samples and navigation instruments, but finds a newborn more daunting than either. Marina, for Marina Svetaeva, and for your sea. When Stalin learned of the child, he summoned Shirshov and delivered the Soviet equivalent of a paternal reprimand. Pyotr Petrovich, sort out your domestic situation. It is unbecoming for a minister and a hero of the Soviet Union to maintain two households. Resolve it after the victory. I will, Comrade Stalin. The 9th of May, 1945. Victory Day. Moscow erupted with an emotion that had no peacetime equivalent. People embraced strangers on the street. Soldiers wept without embarrassment. On Red Square, the crowd was so dense that individual human beings ceased to exist as individuals and became instead a single vast organism shaken with something between grief and joy so extreme they had collapsed into each other. Pyotr found Evgenia backstage at the theater, still in costume from the afternoon performance. He did not say anything for a moment. He simply looked at her. It is over. Now we will be together. Officially. Finally. The divorce was difficult in the way that all divorces involving children are difficult regardless of the historical moment. There were two sons who did not understand why their father was leaving. There were logistics and legal procedures and the particular bureaucratic indignity of formalizing the end of a family in triplicate. Pyotr handled it with the same methodical determination he had brought to keeping the northern convoys running. In 1946, Pyotr Petrovich Shirshov and Evgenia Alexandrovna Gorkusha were married. They were given an apartment in the legendary building on the embankment, the enormous gray structure overlooking the Moscow River, where the entire Soviet elite lived in proximity so intimate it functioned as both privilege and surveillance. 4 rooms. A view of the Kremlin. Papa carried Mama through the doorway like a bride, Marina Shirshova recalled decades later. In the memoir she would spend her adult life writing. Every day he brought flowers. They would sit at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning talking. I was a baby, and I did not understand what they were saying, but I understood that the room had a particular quality when they were both in it, like a fire that gives heat in every direction. They had been married for exactly 4 months when the invitation arrived for the Georgievsky Hall reception. Evgenia dressed carefully that evening, the black dress, her mother's earrings, small pearls, the last remnant of the Yanovsky family's better days, preserved through revolution and evacuation and war with the stubbornness of things that represent something beyond their material value. She stood before the mirror for a long moment while Pyotr stood in the doorway watching her. You are the most beautiful woman in any room you have ever entered, he said. She turned and smiled at him, the specific smile, the one the camera had always understood better than any director's instruction could explain. Then let us go and make the room aware of that fact. The Georgievsky Hall received them as it received everyone that evening, with light and music and the intoxicating illusion that the worst was behind them, that the war was over, that a couple who had survived revolution, displacement, grief, aerial bombardment, and the ordinary catastrophes of loving someone in extraordinary times had finally arrived at the life they deserved. For a few hours standing under those chandeliers, it was possible to believe this completely. Then a small man in round glasses crossed the floor toward them, and the evening shifted in a direction that no one in that room, not Evgenia, not Pyotr, not the 300 witnesses who would spend years not discussing what they had seen, could have anticipated or prevented. The waltz began. And somewhere in the mechanism of history, a clock that had been running since the moment Evgenia Gorkusha first refused to be diminished, quietly reached 0. The sound, when it came, was nothing dramatic. A single sharp report like a branch breaking in a winter forest, a pair of spectacles sliding down a nose, a fork falling somewhere to the right, and a woman's voice, absolutely steady, saying 6 words into a silence so complete that every person in that hall heard them as clearly as if they had been spoken directly into their own ear. I'm not a chorus girl. There is a phrase that appears repeatedly in the declassified KGB files of the Stalin era, written in the dry administrative language that bureaucracies use to describe things they would prefer not to describe too precisely. Taken for clarification of circumstances, not arrested, not seized, not abducted from her dacha on a warm July afternoon while her 1.5-year-old daughter played on the veranda and a housekeeper named Pasha hung laundry in the garden. Simply taken for clarification. As though what happened to Evgenia Gorkusha on the 29th of July, 1946, was a minor administrative procedure, a brief inconvenience, a matter requiring only a few signatures and a short conversation before everything returned to normal. The man who came to the dacha on the Rubliovka highway that afternoon was Viktor Semyonovich Abakumov, Minister of State Security of the USSR. He arrived in a black ZIS automobile. He walked to the garden gate and called her name in a pleasant, unhurried voice. He explained that the theater had telephoned urgently. A rehearsal, a premiere approaching, the director was insisting. He smiled. He spread his hands in the universal gesture of a reasonable man conveying an unreasonable inconvenience. He was, by every account, entirely cordial. Evgenia hesitated at the gate. Something was wrong. She would say this later in the interrogation transcript, in the increasingly unsteady handwriting that her daughter would one day be unable to read without stopping. Something felt wrong. But how do you refuse a minister? How do you say to the second-ranking official of the secret police apparatus, "I do not believe you. Please leave my property"? You don't. Not in 1946. Not in any year of that particular era. She handed Marina to Pasha. She kissed her daughter's forehead. The child began to cry immediately, the sudden, desperate crying of a very small person who understands something that she cannot yet articulate, and clung to her mother's neck with both hands. "Mama will be back this evening, my sunshine. I will bring you a new doll." The ZIS drove past the theater without slowing. The inner prison of the MGB on Lubyanka Square occupies a physical space in the center of Moscow that most Muscovites even today prefer not to contemplate too directly. The building's still there. It houses now the offices of the Federal Security Service. Tourists photograph it from a respectful distance. The square in front of it's pleasant in summer with benches and linden trees. There is nothing in the architecture to indicate what occurred in the floors below street level during the years when Lavrentiy Beria ran the organization that occupied it. Cell number 13, 2 meters by 3, no windows. A single bulb burning at full intensity 24 hours a day. An iron cot, a bucket. The particular silence of underground spaces broken only by distant footsteps in corridors that all sounded identical and led, apparently, everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Evgenia Gorkusha ceased to be Evgenia Gorkusha in that cell. She became prisoner number 13. The name was not a poetic flourish. It was the literal administrative designation assigned to her file. Her name did not appear in any official document for the first 5 months of her detention because no warrant for her arrest had been issued. She did not officially exist as a prisoner because she was not officially a prisoner. She was simply, in the language of the machine, a person being held for the clarification of circumstances. No lawyer, no notification of family, no charge, no date, nothing. Pyotr Shirshov returned from Sevastopol to an empty apartment. Pasha, the housekeeper, was sitting at the kitchen table with Marina on her lap. Both of them red-eyed, the child having exhausted herself, crying and subsided into the slack, damp stillness of a small person who has spent all available resources on grief and has none left. On the table, a cold cup of tea, a child's picture book open to a page showing a rabbit in a garden. Pyotr's diary entry for that evening is 6 words long. Abakumov took her. God. For what? What followed was a year that Pyotr Shirshov's colleagues at the Naval Ministry would later describe, in the careful language of people who had learned the cost of saying too much, as a period of visible personal difficulty. The minister of the naval fleet of the USSR, hero of the Soviet Union, Arctic conqueror, the man who had kept the northern supply routes open through the worst years of the war, spent his official working hours managing a fleet and his unofficial hours doing something that no amount of heroism or institutional rank could make any less futile, searching for his wife inside a system specifically designed to make people unfindable. He wrote letters to every official body he could identify. The letters were received, logged, and filed in the special category reserved for correspondence that powerful people prefer not to answer. He made telephone calls that were not returned. He requested meetings that were perpetually postponed. He leveraged every connection accumulated across a career built on genuine achievement and genuine sacrifice, and discovered one by one that connections are extraordinarily useful for everything except the one thing that actually matters to you. He could not find her. He could not confirm she was alive. He could not confirm she was in Moscow or in Russia or anywhere on Earth at all. Marina, who was 2 years old and therefore remembered nothing consciously but absorbed everything emotionally, told interviewers decades later, "I have a very early memory of sitting on the floor near Papa's legs while he sat at his desk. I don't know what he was doing, writing maybe. What I remember is the quality of the silence. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a person who is fighting very hard against something invisible." The interrogations followed the standard architecture of the era. Investigator Likachev was, by the testimony of his own later colleagues, a craftsman of his particular dark art. The reclassified archive contains his operational notes, brisk, professional, entirely without effect, alongside the transcripts of his sessions with prisoner number 13. Reading them in sequence produces a specific and deeply unpleasant sensation. The experience of watching a methodology applied with the patience and thoroughness of a person who has done this many times before and expects the same result this time. The method was called the conveyor, continuous interrogation in rotating shifts so that the investigators rested while the prisoner did not. Questions asked on Monday were asked again on Wednesday and again on Friday, identical in wording, delivered with identical calm, as though the asking itself, the sheer repetitive insistence of the question, would eventually wear through whatever a person was made of the way water wears through limestone, not quickly, but certainly. Your connections with British intelligence, 1939, the filming of The Fifth Ocean, foreign correspondents, were present on set. They were journalists. I gave interviews about cinema. You transmitted information about Soviet aviation. I played an aviator in a fictional film. You will sign the statement. I will not sign a statement that is false. You will sign. The handwriting in the transcripts, Evgenia's responses, recorded by hand in the standard format required by MGB procedure, is clear and controlled in the early sessions, a teacher's handwriting. Precise, slightly formal, the handwriting of a woman who took language seriously. As the weeks passed and the sessions accumulated, the letters began to lose their edges. By the third month, the signature at the bottom of each page was barely recognizable as the same person's, but she did not sign the central statement. Not for 5 months. Not until Colonel Rodos arrived. There is very little that this investigation will say about Colonel Pavel Rodos, because very little needs to be said. His reputation within the MGB was specific and unambiguous, and even within an institution not known for its sensitivity to human suffering, his name produced a particular quality of discomfort in those who knew it. After Stalin's death, when the special tribunal reviewing MGB crimes called Rodos to testify, prosecutor Roman Rudenko described him on the record as a vile person with the mentality of a degenerate. This is the man who was assigned to Evgenia Gorkusha's case in the 5th month of her detention, when the standard conveyor method had failed to produce the required documentation. The medical examination record, filed on the 14th of November, 1946, is written in the flat clinical language of a document that is simultaneously a record of what occurred and a bureaucratic instrument for obscuring it. Multiple contusions, 2 fractured ribs, damage to internal organs, evidence of sustained physical coercion. In December, Evgenia was brought to an interrogation room for what she was told would be a standard session. The door opened and Pyotr Shirshov walked in. He had aged, she would tell her mother later, by at least 10 years. His face had the color and texture of old paper. He stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked at her. And whatever he saw in that moment, whatever the 5 months had done to the woman who had stood before a mirror and pearl earrings and told him the room would know she was there, he did not speak for a long time. "Zhenichka, my God, what have they done to you?" "Petya." Her voice was careful, controlled, as though she was rationing something. "Forget me, live for Marina. I have signed everything. I'm a spy, a traitor, whatever they require. I cannot continue." "Do not say that. You're not guilty of anything. I will reach Stalin. I will fix this." "Time is up," said the investigator, returning to the room. It was the last time they would ever speak to each other. Pyotr Shirshov did reach Stalin. He went through his old friend, Rear Admiral Ivan Papanin, the same Papanin who had pulled him out of the Arctic ice by his hands in 1937, the same man who had written in his diary that Petka Shirshov was made of something different from ordinary people. Papanin arranged the meeting. Shirshov stood before the desk of the most powerful man on earth and asked for his wife. Stalin smoked his pipe. He looked out the window. "Pyotr Petrovich, the war is over. There are many enemies of the people. Your wife has been implicated in espionage. These are serious matters." "It is absurd. She's an actress. She knows nothing about intelligence operations." "We will find you another wife, Comrade Shirshov. Young, beautiful, no worse than this one." Oh. Pyotr Shirshov left the Kremlin, drove to the Naval Ministry, locked his office door from the inside, tore the portrait of Stalin from the wall, and stood alone in his office with a bottle of cognac and his service weapon and a piece of paper on which he wrote 4 sentences. "Marina, forgive your father. I could not save Mama. Be strong." For 2 days, no one could open the door. On the 3rd day, someone brought 2-year-old Marina to the corridor outside. She pressed her small mouth to the gap beneath the door and said the only word she knew to say, "Papa, open. Marina wants Papa." The key turned in the lock. Shirshov fell to his knees in the doorway and held his daughter until she stopped trying to understand why he was shaking and simply held him back, with the absolute, uncomplicated loyalty of a very small child who does not yet know that the world contains things that cannot be fixed. He had failed, but he was still alive. And in the particular mathematics of that era, alive was the only currency that allowed any other calculation to take place. The single victory he extracted from the wreckage, leveraging the last remnants of his institutional influence, was the removal of the highest charges from Evgenia's file. The treason article, which carried execution, was replaced with Article 107, speculation, 8 years of corrective labor camps. Not a bullet. At the time, in that particular universe, this passed for mercy. There is a place in the far northeastern corner of Russia where the permafrost begins 3 meters below the surface and never ends. The Kolyma region, Magadan Oblast, a territory roughly the size of Western Europe, containing, at its peak in the 1940s, approximately 500,000 prisoners distributed across a network of camps that the historian Anne Applebaum would later describe as constituting, taken together, a separate civilization. A civilization with its own geography, its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own language, its own relationship to time and the human body and the concept of tomorrow. The locals had a saying about Kolyma that circulated in whispers even among the guards: "Better a bullet than Amchak." Amchak was the settlement where Evgenia Gorkusha arrived in January of 1948, after a journey of such extended misery that the arrival itself, the gates, the watchtowers, the sign reading, "Labor is a matter of honor," registered as almost a relief, simply because it meant the journey was over. The journey had taken 6 weeks. It began at Yaroslavsky Station in Moscow on the 4th of December, 1947. A freight train, 80 women per car, in 3-tier bunks built from rough timber, a single barred window near the ceiling, a bucket in the corner that served all 80 people and was emptied when it was emptied at the discretion of the guards. Among the 80 women in Evgenia's car was a professional criminal with gold teeth, the type known in camp vocabulary as Blatnaya, who asked the standard intake questions of any new arrival: name, offense, sentence. Actress, 8 years. And you, who did you slap? Beria. The car went silent. Then the woman with the gold teeth gave a slow whistle of genuine admiration. She turned to the car at large and issued a declaration that, in the social architecture of that particular world, carried real weight. Girls, nobody touches her. She hit Beria in the face. I respect that. It was, in the circumstances, the closest thing to protection available, and it cost Evgenia nothing except the truth. The train stopped every few days in sidings where the doors were opened and the dead were removed. Some women had been arrested in summer and wore summer clothing. In the Siberian December at -30, summer clothing is not clothing. It is an intention. Evgenia had been given a padded jacket from the common store before departure, one of those small institutional gestures whose arbitrariness was its own form of cruelty, the reminder that whether you lived or died depended not on anything you had done or were, but on which guard happened to be on duty when the jackets were distributed. On the 10th day, the train stopped somewhere in the middle of Siberia, and the women were ordered out for a 5-minute exercise period. Snow stretched to the horizon in every direction. The temperature was approximately -28. Evgenia stepped down from the car and saw the snow, clean, unblemished white. And something happened to her that the women nearby found difficult to describe afterward. She walked to the nearest undisturbed drift and knelt down and pressed her hands into it. She lifted handfuls of it and ate it. She was crying and laughing simultaneously, in the way that the body sometimes defaults to when it has been kept in a confined space with 80 frightened people for 10 consecutive days and suddenly encounters something simple and clean and infinite. A guard shouted, raised his rifle. "Stand up, I will shoot." "Then shoot," said Evgenia Gorkusha without standing up. "Go ahead." The guard did not shoot. He kicked her boot and told her to get back in the car. She stood, brushed snow from her knees, and climbed back in. It was, the gold-toothed woman said later, the moment she understood that this actress was made of something unusual. Vladivostok, the transit prison, then the hold of a ship called the Dalstroy, 7 days across the Okhotsk Sea in winter conditions that reduced half the women to a state below misery and above only unconsciousness. Then Magadan at -45. 20 kilometers on foot from the port to the camp at Amchak, through snow that had been compressed by wind into a surface as hard and treacherous as glass. Women who fell were not helped up by guards. Evgenia walked the 20 kilometers by concentrating on a single instruction she gave herself with every step. The next one, not the destination, not the distance remaining, only the next step, and then the one after that, and then the one after that. It was a technique she had used on stage when a performance was going badly and panic threatened. Reduce the task to its smallest possible increment. Execute that increment. Repeat. The gates of Amchak. The sign. The commandant, Major Sidorov, walking the line of new arrivals with the expression of a man doing inventory. Women, this is not a sanatorium. Settlement of Amchak, the Beria gold mine. 12-hour shifts on the gold workings. Failure to meet quota means the isolation cell. Sabotage means a bullet. Questions. "May I write a letter?" asked Evgenia. Major Sidorov looked at her for a moment. "Once every 6 months, if you earn it." The Beria gold mine. It required a particular quality of historical irony, and history in that era had an apparently inexhaustible supply of it. The woman who had slept Lavrentiy Beria in the most gilded room in Russia now spent 12 hours each day in temperatures that at their lowest reached -50, washing gold-bearing rock in icy water at a facility that bore his name. Her hands, which had learned to move with the specific expressiveness that cameras love, the hands of an actress who understood that emotion lives in the body as much as the face, stopped feeling after approximately 3 minutes in the water and did not recover feeling until the evening when the bunk room temperature, sustained by a stove lit only after the work shift, eventually reached something above 0. She refused twice to participate in the camp's amateur performance evenings, theatrical performances organized for the entertainment of the administrative staff, a tradition in Soviet camps that combined genuine cultural impulse with spectacular bad faith. Gorkusha, we are organizing a performance program, light duties in exchange. You would be moved from the gold line? No, you understand what you are refusing. I understand perfectly. The second time Major Sidorov asked, she told him, "Hey, I have lost my voice." He looked at her steadily for a moment, understanding that she did not mean this literally, and that the real answer was something he did not have the authority or the vocabulary to engage with. He put her back on the gold line. February of 1948, a miracle arrived wearing a sheepskin coat and carrying a small suitcase. Elena Vladimirovna Avramova was 76 years old. The daughter of Stanislav Yanovsky, who had told her that the spine must remain straight regardless of circumstance. The woman who had named her daughter after a poem and carried pearl earrings through a revolution because some things are not negotiable. She'd spent 8 months navigating the bureaucratic architecture of the Gulag administrative system, a structure designed, among its other functions, to be navigated by no one, and had somehow obtained permission to live near her daughter at the Amchak settlement, employed as an accountant in the camp administration. This was not a thing that happened. The files of the MGB contain no explanation for how it was arranged, which suggests either a clerical anomaly of extraordinary proportions or a single humane act by a single unnamed official who decided on one particular afternoon to say yes instead of no. When Evgenia saw her mother walk through the gate of the settlement, she stopped walking and stood entirely still for several seconds. Then she crossed the distance between them at something close to a run, which the frost and the exhaustion and the 8 months on the gold line had reduced to a fast, lurching walk, and pressed her face against her mother's shoulder. "Mama, why do you come to this hell? Dochenka, how could I leave you here alone?" They were given a small, separate dwelling, a room essentially with a stove and 2 cots, which was, in the economy of Amchak, an extraordinary privilege. It came with a guard posted outside the door at all times, which clarified that it was a privilege extended by the institution rather than a right possessed by the people living in it. But it was warmth. It was a door that closed. It was the specific mercy of being able to speak to another human being without performing for an audience of strangers. "Our right to Pyotr," Elena said one evening, placing paper and a pencil on the table. Evgenia sat for a long time looking at the blank page. What do you write to the person you love most when the truth of where you are and what has been done to you would destroy them? And the alternative is a lie, and you no longer have the energy to construct elaborate fictions, and only the simplest true things remain. She wrote 2 letters in total. The first, "Petya, I am alive. Do not search for me. Do not destroy yourself. Something has changed in me that cannot be unchanged. The Zhenya you love died on Lubyanka. What remains is something else. Protect Marina. Do not let her know the truth about her mother. Say I died of illness. It is kinder." The second, written in July. "Farewell, my dear. Mama has arrived. We are together. Do not worry about me. The nature here is very beautiful. The hills, the taiga, like a fairy tale, only the fairy tale is terrible. I kiss you and Marina. Forgive me for everything." Her sister Svetlana came in July during the university vacation, a medical student young enough to cry without concealing it, which she did the moment she saw Evgenia. "My God, Zhenichka, what have they done to you? You are like a skeleton. Don't cry, Sveta. Everything's fine. It will all be over soon." "What do you mean, over? Over how?" A pause, a small specific smile that Svetlana would spend the rest of her life trying to forget and failing. All of it. Everything. It simply ends. Svetlana had brought medicine, vitamins, heart drops, and sleeping tablets. A small bottle, clearly labeled, handed over in the innocent and devastating belief that insomnia was the problem being addressed. "Only 2 at a time. Be careful." "Of course," said Evgenia, and she put the bottle under her pillow next to the others. The 10th of August, 1948, morning. Evgenia woke early and was, her mother noted immediately, different. Animated in a way she had not been in months, her eyes were clear. She suggested that Elena and Svetlana take the supply cart to Magadan, a journey of several hours, to buy provisions, perhaps even a watermelon if one could be found, a small celebration. "Come with us," Elena said. "The fresh air. I'm not permitted to leave the settlement perimeter. You go. I will rest. For the first time in 2 years, I will be alone, just for a few hours." Elena hesitated. Svetlana touched her arm gently. "Mama, she needs this. Time alone. It's normal." They left at dawn. Evgenia stood at the window of the small room and watched them go, and raised her hand in a wave and smiled. And the smile, Elena would say for the rest of her life, was the most beautiful and the most terrible thing she had ever seen on her daughter's face, because it was completely peaceful. The smile of a person who has made a decision and found, in the making of it, something that resembled relief. When they returned that evening, Evgenia was lying on her cot with her hands folded on her chest, her face entirely calm, several empty medicine bottles arranged on the table beside her with a neatness that was, in itself, a kind of final statement. The camp doctor, examining her, leaned close to Elena and spoke very quietly. Strange death. Far too much medication for one person to accumulate, even collecting every package. Someone helped. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "What are you saying?" "Nothing. Forget I spoke. I will write cardiac failure in the report." He wrote cardiac failure. The date was the 11th of August, 1948. Evgenia Alexandrovna Gorkusha was 33 years old. The fairy tale was over. History does not deliver justice on a schedule. It delivers it late, incompletely, in bureaucratic envelopes on ordinary Tuesday mornings to people who have spent years not allowing themselves to hope too precisely, because precise hope in the world that produced Evgenia Gorkusha had a way of becoming the thing that finally broke you when it was disappointed. The telegram arrived at the Institute of Oceanography in Moscow in August of 1949. 1 year, almost to the day, after Evgenia died in a small room at the edge of the permafrost with her hands folded on her chest and empty medicine bottles arranged beside her with the particular neatness of a person who wanted to leave things orderly. The secretary held the envelope for a long time before carrying it to the director's office. Everyone in the institute knew that Pyotr Petrovich Shirshov waited for news from his wife. Everyone had been waiting with him in the sideways, unacknowledged manner of people who care about someone but cannot say so directly, because caring about the wrong person in the wrong era was itself a risk that required management. She knocked. She entered. She placed the envelope on the desk. Pyotr Shirshov opened it with the careful movements of a man who has been opening letters for years, expecting either salvation or catastrophe, and has learned to approach both with the same steadiness because the alternative, allowing himself to feel the full weight of what might be inside before he knows what is inside, is simply not survivable. He read it once, then he placed it flat on the desk and looked at the wall. Your wife, Evgenia Alexandrovna Gorkusha-Shirshova, died on the 11th of August, 1948. Cause of death, cardiac failure. buried in the settlement of Amchak. She had been dead for a year. For an entire year he had written letters into silence, had pressed the Institute's telephone operators for connections to Magadan that never came through, had told his daughter Marina, who was 4 years old and asked for her mother with the regularity and the devastating simplicity of a small child who does not yet understand why some questions are not answered, that Mama was far away but would come home. For a year she had been in the frozen ground at the top of the world. Papa came home and locked himself in his study, Marina Shirshova recalled in an interview given to the journalist Natalia Gevorkian in 2004. 3 days. Nobody could enter. His colleagues stood outside the door and begged him. On the third day he came out. I did not recognize him. He was entirely gray. He sat down and took me on his knee and said only, "Marinochka, Mama's gone. She's been gone for a long time." And that was all he ever said to me about it for as long as he lived. Pyotr Petrovich Shirshov had by that point already lost his ministerial position. On the 30th of April, 1948, 3 months before Evgenia died, though he did not yet know she was dying, he had been called to Stalin's office and informed, in the flat administrative language the leader used for dismissals, that he was being relieved of his duties as Minister of the Naval Fleet due to health considerations. The official record uses the phrase in connection with the state of his health. Everyone understood the real reason. The wife of an enemy of the people cannot be the wife of a minister. The logic was not complicated. It did not need to be. Papa came home like a beaten dog, Marina recalled. He sat down in his armchair and said, "Marinochka, Papa is no longer a minister. Papa is now nobody." And then he said, "But perhaps now they will release Mama." He still believed she was alive. He was waiting for her. He thought that losing his position might satisfy them, that the debt had been paid. The debt, as it turned out, had been paid by Evgenia, and Beria never forgave anyone anything. The cancer had been diagnosed in 1948, the same year Evgenia died. The same year Pyotr lost his position, the same year his world completed its collapse from every direction simultaneously. 3 operations in 5 years, the disease progressed with the purposeful efficiency of something that had been waiting for the body's resistance to falter, and Pyotr Shirshov's resistance, by 1948, had been failing for 2 years. His colleague Alexander Vinogradov wrote in his personal diary, portions of which were published in the journal Priroda in 2007, that Shirshov arrived at the Institute at 6 in the morning and left at midnight every day during his final years. He works like a man possessed. Yesterday he said a strange thing. "Soon I will see Zhenya. She's waiting." I did not know how to respond. On the 17th of February, 1953, 14 days before Stalin's death, which would have meant nothing to him by that point, Pyotr Petrovich Shirshov died. He was 48 years old. The surgeon who performed his final operation told Vinogradov afterward, "He asked me before I put him under, 'Doctor, don't try too hard. I have no reason left to live. Zhenichka is gone. Without her, I am like a man without air.'" At the funeral, Ivan Papanin, the same man who had pulled Shirshov from the Arctic ice by his hands, who had written in his diary that Petka Shirshov was the soul of their expedition, who had arranged the impossible meeting with Stalin that had accomplished exactly nothing, stood at the graveside and said, "When Zhenichka died, Pyotr died too. He simply took 4 years to finish. Now for the accounting. History is slow, as established, but it is occasionally thorough." On the 26th of June, 1953, 4 months after Shirshov's death, 10 months after Stalin's, Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria was arrested at a session of the Presidium of the Central Committee. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, who had defeated the Wehrmacht, personally placed the handcuffs on his wrists. The symbolism was not lost on anyone present. At his subsequent interrogation, investigators raised the case of Gorkusha-Shirshova, The transcript of this exchange was declassified in 2003 and published in the journal Istochnik. The actress, the wife of Minister Shirshov. You ordered her arrest in 1946. Beria's response, I don't recall such a case. Evgenia Alexandrovna Gorkusha, arrested July 29, 1946. Died Amchak camp, August 11, 1948. You personally authorized the arrest warrant. A pause. She brought it on herself. She should have been smarter. On the 23rd of December, 1953, Lavrentiy Beria was shot. Among the charges, unlawful repression of Soviet citizens. The name Evgenia Gorkusha did not appear in the official verdict. She was one of thousands, and the verdict could not contain thousands of names, but she was there, in the aggregate, in the number that the historians would spend the following decades trying to make legible one face at a time. Viktor Abakumov, the man who had come to the dacha on the Rublyovka highway with a plausible story about a theater rehearsal, was shot in 1954. Investigator Likachev and Colonel Rodos, the two men whose names appear most frequently in Evgenia's interrogation transcripts, each received 25-year camp sentences. Whether they served them in full, the available records do not confirm. Justice is a complicated word. What occurred was not justice. What occurred was the machine briefly turning on its own operators, which is a different thing entirely and should not be confused with accountability. 1956. The 20th Party Congress. Khrushchev's secret speech. The word rehabilitation began moving through Soviet society like water through cracked earth, slowly, unevenly, finding some channels and not others, reaching some people and not others, always arriving later than it should. On an ordinary morning in the autumn of that year, a letter arrived at the apartment on Kotelny-Chesky embankment, the same legendary building on the Moscow River where Evgenia and Pyotr had lived in their 4-month marriage, where a 1.5-year-old girl had clutched her mother's neck and cried at a garden gate. Marina Petrovna Shirshova was 12 years old. She read the official document herself because there was no adult present who could read it for her, and because she was, by the age of 12, already accustomed to receiving information without a buffer. The case against Gorkusha, Evgenia Alexandrovna, has been reviewed. The verdict is overturned. In the absence of criminal conduct, posthumously rehabilitated. 3 lines. 11 words in the operative clause. An entire life measured in 11 words on a government letterhead. Marina put the letter on the table. She put on her coat. She walked to the nearest revival cinema because she had known for weeks that the cinema was showing The Fifth Ocean, the film that had made her mother famous, the film that had been banned for 10 years, the film that was now permitted to exist again because the state that had erased it had partially erased itself. She sat in the front row. When the lights went down and the screen flickered to life, and a young woman with dark hair and an interior light that no camera had ever fully captured appeared in the frame, laughing, singing, entirely alive, Marina Shirshova, aged 12, began to cry with a completeness and an abandon that made the strangers around her turn and look, and then, one by one, look away. She could not stop. She did not try to stop. It was our first meeting, she would write 47 years later in the book that took her a lifetime to be ready to write. She was 25 on that screen. I was 12 in that seat. We had never been in the same room while she was alive, and I was old enough to understand who she was. That cinema was the only place we ever met. In 2001, Marina Petrovna Shirshova, oceanographer, daughter, keeper of a story the state had spent a decade trying to delete, traveled to Magadan. The settlement of Amchak had become what Soviet industrial outposts become when the industry that created them collapses and the people who staffed them disperse. Empty barracks, rust-colored wire, a landscape that the permafrost had been slowly reclaiming for decades, pushing back up through the foundations of structures that had been built on frozen ground and were returning to it. An elderly local resident, one of the very few remaining, led her to a section of the abandoned cemetery. They buried people here in '48. I remember your mother. She was beautiful, even there. He showed her the approximate location. The grave was unmarked, as the graves of camp prisoners were unmarked, because a marked grave is a legible grave, and legibility was not a priority of the system that created Amchak. Elena Vladimirovna, who had arrived at this place in a sheepskin coat with a small suitcase and the absolute refusal of a woman, raised to keep her spine straight regardless of circumstances, had dug the grave herself. She had dug it to a depth of nearly 2 meters down through the active layer of soil into the permafrost beneath. The old man explained why. She said, let the body at least be preserved. She said it like she was giving instructions, very calm, very decided. A 76-year-old woman digging alone into frozen ground in the Kolyma summer so that whatever the system had not managed to take would remain intact underground, waiting for someone to come looking. Marina stood at the place for a long time without speaking. In 2003, she published the book, The Forgotten Diary of a Polar Biologist. Her father's diaries, her mother's letters, the KGB transcripts, the testimony of witnesses, the medical records, the interrogation logs with their progressively deteriorating handwriting, the 3-line rehabilitation notice, the surgeon's quiet remark before the final operation, the entry from the 29th of July, 1946. 6 words. Abakumov took her. God, for what? All of it, finally, between covers, finally, with names attached and dates attached, and the specific gravity of documented truth rather than the weightless fog of rumor and silence. Mama died undefeated, Marina wrote in the book's final pages. Yes, they broke her physically, but not spiritually. She did not become Beria's lover. She did not betray her love. She did not renounce herself. And that slap, one hand against one face in one room on one evening, was, in its own way, a shot heard in reverse, not the shot that begins a war, the shot that begins the end of one. The beginning of the end of their cursed system, fired by a woman who simply refused to pretend that power made ugliness beautiful. There is a cinema on a Moscow street that still occasionally screens Soviet films from the 1940s. The projection equipment is old. The seats have been reupholstered twice. The screen is slightly smaller than it used to be because the wall behind it was resurfaced at some point and a few centimeters were lost in the process. On that screen, if the right film is running, a young woman with dark hair appears. She's 25 years old, and she will be 25 years old forever, which is the one mercy the camera offers. It keeps people exactly as they were in the moment it found them, regardless of what happens afterward. She laughs. She sings. She looks directly into the lens with the specific quality that the director Anensky called an interior light and spent the rest of his career failing to find again in anyone else. She does not know in that moment on the screen what is coming. She knows only the scene and the camera and the particular happiness of a person doing precisely the thing they were made to do. That is what remains. That, and a daughter who went to a cinema at 12 years old and whispered a word into the dark and spent the next 50 years making sure the dark did not swallow it. The word was Mama. It was enough. It had to be enough. And in the end, after everything the machine did and everything it took and everything it tried to make disappear, it was.